Good morning. Since this is the history in Japan is very different from the kind of history we heard last week of the work in Mozambique, but just try to be as brief as possible. But the time from 1549 to 1640 was known as the Catholic century in Japan, and in 1542, Portuguese traders gained entry. And in August of 1549, Francis Xavier, a Jesuit priest, entered Japan, and he was kind of the cause of Christ and Portugal. He was only there 2 years, really never learned the language or the culture, but baptized 150 people. But then in 1614, began a time of persecution and martyrdom. And in 1859, Japan was opened again with the entrance of Admiral Perry into Japan, and 5 Protestant missionaries entered. 1 Presbyterian, 1 Episcopalian, and 3 RCA, Reformed Church. Reverend Samuel Brown and Samuel Simmons, who was an MD, and this man left the mission the next several years, but stayed in Japan to minister as a doctor. And then Reverend Guido Verbeck, and in 1861, Reverend James Ballack. So amongst the 5 first missionaries, Protestant missionaries, were 3 of the Reformed Church. Their wives were called assistant missionaries. There's a definitive book about the history of Japan in the church library, I'm sure, written by Dr. Gordon Lehman, a very good history of Japan. And I learned in there that in 1861, Robert Pruin, who was a Rutgers graduate, an RCA member, was appointed the first ambassador to Japan by President Lincoln. The first Christian church was started by RCA missionaries. It was called the Church of Christ in Japan. They never started Reformed churches in Japan. This has been our policy around the world, to work with the national church, in this case starting the national church. But it was called the Church of Christ in Japan. And from the beginning, the missionaries tended to reach the upper classes in Japan. So there was a great influence on education. One of our RCA missionaries was help to start a Ferris Girls' School in Yokohama, where Elaine Tanis taught for several years, and many RCA missionaries. And also with the Presbyterians started Meiji Gakuin University, which has had a long history of programs with Hope College. Also a Baiko Girls' School in southern Japan in Shimonoseki started with the Presbyterians, and that's where Kent and Joyce Fry worked for several years. And the Reformed Church was also very influenced in starting Tokyo University. Todai is known as the top university in Japan, and from the beginning had help of the RCA missionaries. Though Japan is not a Christian country by any means, I've heard maybe 2% of the population now is Christian, a very small percentage, but the influence has been great. In Japan, there's Buddhism, Shintoism, and Christianity. And the influence of the Christians has been very strong. I learned from Gordon's book that 3 of the post-war prime ministers were Christian. I didn't realize that, but I always remember the statement of a Japanese seminary student at a Western seminary who said, "Becoming a Christian in Japan is like being a foreigner in your own country." So from 1859 to 2009, 188 missionaries were appointed by the Reformed Church to Japan. from the years 1974 to 2011, 205 associates were appointed by the Adult Voluntary Services to go to Japan, usually to serve as 2 years or 1 year. And that includes many members of this congregation or the parents of people who are in this group today. Their children served in Japan as associates. So in 1963, at the invitation of the United Church of Christ in Japan, 4 couples went to Japan in 1963. Tom and Barbara Harris, George and Joyce McGee, John and Helene Zweikheisen, and Sarah and myself. And we were there until 1993. Joyce, being much younger, stayed longer and served long years there.
Younger.
So that's just a brief history of it.
Thank you, Bill.
I want to add to that, the women's school, girls' school that was in Yokohama was the pioneer in women's education
Yes.
in Japan.
So we're going to start by, at the beginning, you all spent your first 2 years in language training. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
You asked that question and I put on my notes, it was a kind of nakedness. You go as an adult, you think, and you end up less than a kindergartner and make no sense to anyone. So we would go to language school for maybe 2 or 3 hours in the morning, and then George would insist that we go out to the shops in the afternoon and expose ourselves. And we'd prepare 1 or 2 questions and go to a shop and ask, how much is it and what do you use this for? Something like that. And I had to do that every day. And George, who looked not as social or as willing to meet people, was the one who went out and did this exercise in language.
Would you like to add anything, both of you?
Well, when I got there, I realized I couldn't read. I couldn't understand the thing. I was like a baby.
Yep.
I mean, I couldn't say anything either. It's a very
Humbling.
disturbing feeling. We got off the ship. We did go by ship. We got off the ship. The Zweigheisens, who'd been there a few months earlier, met us on the ship. My first experience was to go to what I thought was going to be a Japanese restaurant. We had a hamburger with a fried egg on top. So that was true. But yeah, as Joyce said, I will just say a bit about our own living experience there. Joyce and George were in a mission home. We lived in a little Japanese apartment, and we were the first ones to do that. Tom and Barb Harris lived there also. And so we, instead of going to the traditional Japanese language school, Bill and I went to International Christian University, which was a whole different something or other, because in our classes were Chinese students.
Oh, yeah.
Some students who had lived in Japan for many years and who knew a lot more. Well, they knew everything more than we did. But it was a good experience because we met people from China, from Korea, and other cultures who were there also to study Japanese. So it was a different experience because we were in a Japanese situation, not a mission home, but it was a good one.
And that also meant that they learned the ordinary everyday expressions in Japanese that we didn't learn at the universities.
And they're very useful and used every day.
Yeah. Thank you. Would you go ahead and put the map up, please, of Hokkaido? So when you were when you went to your assignment, they were in different places in Japan. And I wondered if you could each identify the place where you were assigned and tell us something about that place, the culture, the landscape, the
Okay, we were in this town, Tamakamai. This is a very cold coast. The ocean coming from this side is very cold coming off the Aleutians, and this whole part is very stormy in the spring and late winter. But the churches we served, there's one here and one in Muroran and one over here in Toyako. And then think of this whole area as our parish. There was a church here in Edimo and two over here, and then also a couple here. So this area is,
and how many miles would you from one village church to the other? I mean, to the last one the furthest away.
From here to here, if there was a straight line, it would be across Michigan from Holland to Detroit.
And that's their parish.
And there were 8 churches and very far apart from each other, but they formed what in Japan would be a class, in America would be a classis.
Thank you.
Joyce, could you show us on this map the island that you are pointing to is at
Right
the
here.
top of Japan? That's
And
right.
this, I'm shaky. You're scaring me. That's our home right there.
So while we're there, can you tell us what you did tell us it's Stormy? Can you tell us about the livelihood or where, especially?
Yeah. Well, I'll point out that on that last map, we were in the Maine, New England area, cold winter. Yeah. And Japan is the length of the U.S. East Coast. And the Unzikers were even more snowy. Ours was not so snowy, but just cold all summer.
So Sarah, you want to use your pointer? Can you show us, you or Bill, or both of you, where you lived and where were the villages you served? Back to Hokkaido.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we were in the city of Otaru, which is on the Japan seaside, and we were assigned to this district. Hokkaido as an island is the same size as the lower peninsula of Michigan and about the same population. And, well,
You want to go back to Hokkaido,
yeah,
right?
go back to the map again.
That's all Hokkaido.
So we were assigned to a district there as a district missionaries.
So can you tell us what's the livelihood perhaps of that area? Let's go back.
Hokkaido is a port city.
Let's go back to Hokkaido.
It's okay.
Yeah, it just turns out that the laser pointer also can advance the slides. So that's why if you push the wrong button, it's a problem.
So just the red button at the bottom.
Okay, so it's our home. We got it right there on the Japan seacoast. We could see mountains.
Yeah, your mic.
Sorry, we could see mountains, and we were right in a harbor. One of our places was Yoichi, another was Iwanai, right out here, and then another was Puchan, right here with Niseko, which is a huge ski mountain. In our home in Otaru, we could look out and see the harbor, and from my kitchen window, I could see 3 ski jumps. And we have some pictures. You can see what it looked like in the winter. Our average snowfall was 20 feet. That was every year. So we have some snapshots you can see.
So
I'll add to that the layman's son, what's his name? Tim Layman wrote a very nice article about Hokkaido for National Geographic. And in that article, he said Hokkaido is one of the snowiest inhabited places in the world.
And all that snow didn't make a bit of difference. We never had a snow day. It just,
I'm sorry.
you live with it.
Our first term in Japan, we didn't have a snowblower, and I had snow shovels made of wood, bamboo, metal, plastic, and all kinds of things. But after our first furlough, we took a snowblower back from Holland. That year there was no snow in Holland, so it never got out of the box. So it was a lifesaver.
Thank you. So I understand that once you were in your assignments, you lived in ordinary Japanese neighborhoods. How did you get to know people? And I understand your children were in school. Did that kind of extend your possible friendships and contacts?
First of all, in Japan, when you move into a neighborhood, it's kind of protocol, nice to do, to make a neighborhood call on each person and give a little gift.
Even if you're not a missionary, right?
And right. So somebody has to tell you as a missionary to do that. But having done that, people were curious about us and were interested in making that. And when our kids went into school, the neighborhood ladies made by hand a little cushion that you sit on your, and a bag that you take your whatever essentials in, and 2 or 3 other things that
For the
are-
kids.
for the kids that are necessary for school. I would not have known how to do that, but the neighborhood.
I remember
provided.
that when Nathan and I were there for a year, he was in kindergarten, first grade. And so a Japanese friend who adopted us, even though she didn't speak English, came with whatever we needed for that occasion.
They were very kind and looked after us, actually.
Do you want to say something about your living in your neighborhood?
Well, for one thing,
Closer.
Canadian missionaries had lived there for, I don't know how many years. But one interesting thing, they had a maid living with them. And gradually my neighbor said to me, you know, Mrs. McLeod never went shopping and you're always doing your own thing, which was down the street. If you went out our driveway, you went up or you went down to the harbor. So 5 minutes down the street was a fish and vegetable store. Dirt floors. She did have ice to keep the fish cold, but they were really good fish. And so then I would go down and do my shopping there. And I think that's partly how I became, or how the neighbors became used to me.
Sure.
Because
Mhm.
I was out in the community all the time. And as Joyce mentioned a bit about our kids starting Japanese school, immediately I was known as David's mother. Mrs. Unzicker, of course, or Sarah. It was David's mother. And that's what how the neighbors knew me.
But our kids felt at home. And I tell the story about our oldest son, David, who went to the church kindergarten. He went on the city bus every morning down to the church kindergarten. But one morning I got up and David wasn't there. And his cereal bowl was left on the table. But it turns out he had gone to kindergarten early. He wanted to get there early so he could get his first choice of the playthings. But I called the church and the pastor, and he said, no, David wasn't there. Well, David had gone and found the place was still locked. Nobody was there. So I got in the car and headed down, but just got to the bottom of our hill, and here was David just got off the bus, coming back home since there was nobody there yet that morning. So, but they felt at home and very free.
This is maybe a good place to say that in Japan, at the time that we went, public education started with first grade when you were 6 years old. But for many years before that, the churches, many years before we got there, the churches had traditionally had kindergartens, and this helps pay expenses at the church and pastor's salary and so on. And it's also a way of getting into the neighborhood for people to know you and make contacts. So the church kindergartens were a big thing. Everybody knew about church kindergartens, and it did not require faith or any pronouncements of it to go. So there were very few Christian children in the kindergarten. But
One of the things you told me was that various kinds of outreach to people who are otherwise isolated and need,
Mhm.
handicapped and so forth, started after the war by Japanese Christians and missionaries. Those then were adopted by the government as regular programs available to people. And so it was very striking witness.
Mhm. The number of baptized Christians is very small. Bill said maybe 2%. I've heard less than 1%. Nobody knows how to make percentages, but the influence of the church
Yeah.
has been big through those educational institutions.
We've identified on the map those villages they were serving. What did serving those villages amount to or entail in both your cases?
Well, for Bill, it was preaching every Sunday in one of the church.
Oh, I
They all
didn't-
had churches there, very small, but Bill was preaching every Sunday.
Almost everything.
So you would go from village to village?
Yes, there were 7 churches in our districts, and 3 of them, well, several in our city, but then the several out in other towns that I had to go over mountain passes to get to, which were a challenge in the wintertime, but and sometimes there'd only be 1 or 2 or 3 people there for the service, but we go out to reach them and worked with young people there and also did English classes.
I should say, and I'm not sure about, I think it's similar in Tamakamai. We lived in, Otaru was a city of 180,000. We were the only Americans there.
Wow.
Later on, there was some Overseas Missionary Fellowship people there, and we, of course, became very good friends, but it was, we.
Isolating in one way,
In one way.
but opened you
Yeah,
to a
because-
large part of the,
Mhm.
that part of Japan.
And these churches that we travel in the country to, none of our churches were more than, say, 30 people on a Sunday morning. They're very small.
Can you tell us a little bit what it was like for Japanese Christians living in these villages?
That's where church became home and the
Mhm.
community.
Mhm.
Of course, they lived with their neighbors and friends, but their families weren't always Christian. Typically in Japan, the wife was a Christian.
Mhm.
Husbands had a difficult time. They might believe, but becoming baptized
Mhm.
might affect their work situation. Having to go to church on Sunday when you might have to, be at work or doing something. Going to church meetings would take time that you should be spending at work or with your coworkers out drinking or something. So being a Christian had certain difficulties. especially
Negative
for men.
factors.
Negative factors, especially for men. One of our neighbors whose wife was a Christian and whose husband believed for years, he was a tailor.
Mhm.
And he said, if I'm at church on Sunday, I can't help go out and clean the neighborhood, do all the things that the neighbors are doing. And so he wouldn't be baptized. And, we don't think of that kind of problem so
No.
much here in the States.
Another example of that is was a young couple, and he had been brought up by Christian parents, but he was for employment in a company, I've forgotten which one, and most of the company, New Year's time or other times too, they'll have a big company meeting and they all bow to the whatever they
An
bow to.
altar.
Yeah, an altar of some kind. I suppose it's Shinto. And if one head does not bow, that head sticks out, and that head needs to be pounded down.
That becomes a saying, the head
Yeah.
that sticks up gets pounded
Gets
down.
pounded down. So this young man said, "No, not while I'm working will I join the church. I'll do that when I'm, retired." As far as I know, that has not happened. His wife was very faithful, but
We had one case where Sarah talked about the wives being a Christian. One of our country churches, one of the wives who was not a Christian said she wanted to talk to us. So she came into the city to our home and she said that her husband was a dentist. We knew him. He was an elder in the church. And she was complaining because the church took up so much of his time. And as he didn't have time to do the proper things that he should be doing, going to the Buddhist services for funerals and such. And because he was so busy at church, and she was wondering if we could talk to him and somehow help him to realize that he had responsibilities as a Christian, as a dentist in that very small community.
So maybe we should talk about what are the other religions. Almost 99% of Japan would say they're Buddhist. It just goes with territory, and funerals are almost universally done through the Buddhists. But when you're born of Shinto. That, you hold two, and it doesn't matter. So everybody that's Japanese is called a Shinto, and they have certain Shinto rites. There are sometimes some funerals, but not too many.
Weddings. are
Weddings.
Shinto. And New Year's, you go to the Shinto shrine
Yep,
at New
yep.
Year's all dressed up in your kimono and your best everything. That's the big celebration. This all brings up lots of memories. Speaking about husbands and wives, one of my best friends,
Close.
was a faithful Christian. Her husband was not. One day she came home, and in a typical Japanese home, they have a Buddhist altar and a Shinto god shelf. The altar is to honor the ancestors, and the Shinto god shelf, they often put little offerings of fruit or something on to honor the gods. And it's a kind of an animistic thing. And one day Mrs. Murakami came home, and her husband had just thrown out the god shelf and the Buddhist altar. He said, "We don't need these anymore." I don't think he was ever baptized, but he just said, "These don't mean anything."
Mhm.
And it was just eye-opening to think that her faith all those years had made that difference. in him.
Amen. Yeah. Sarah, you told us when we were chatting that you and other women from the church would go on a regular basis to a old person's home where you would prepare diapers because they didn't have Depends, and that led to some outreach more than just the diapers.
It did lead to the outreach, but more than that, I think, home is not just where you live and your family. Home is friends.
Yeah.
And this place, we went every month we were there 30 years, and I'm guessing at least 20 of those years, I went every month with these women, 5 or 6 or 7 women. I drove a car, and we could get 7 people in because they're little and we squeeze.
They are.
And as she said, they didn't have disposable diapers. We made diapers out of just layers of cloth and sewed them together. And the laundry came in, and we had to fold all of them. At later times, we did go visit the patients. But to me, we sat on the floor on the straw mat tatami and just talking and listening to those women. And there was no restriction. There weren't any men around. There was no Japanese sensei around. They just felt free to talk. And I learned so much about their lives. I said to one of them one day, we were talking about the war, which people didn't talk about for a long time. And I said, why did you think the emperor was divine?
Mhm.
She said, from the time we were born, every home, I guess, had a picture. We bowed every morning. You just bowed, and he was the God, and you bowed to him. She said, we never knew anything different.
Mhm.
And, that was just eye-opening to me. And we talked about all kinds of different things. One of the women, who was a really dear friend, talked about her work. In Japan, the department stores all have a big food store at the bottom. And Sunday's the biggest shopping day. And so Mrs. Sato worked in the meat department. She was a faithful Christian, and finally she convinced her boss, could she just have 2 hours off on Sunday morning to come to church? And he agreed. That did not sit well with her fellow workers at all. But she said, I just kept doing it. And she said, after a year, they finally said to me, "What's so important on Sunday morning? What do you do?" And so she was able to give a testimony.
I
think,
was very grateful that we never lived on a mission compound. We always lived in, well, like in Japan, in Tokyo, in an apartment, and then just in a house in the neighborhood, which was good. But we still could not participate in a lot of the activities of the neighborhood, which were on Sunday, because we
oh, yeah.
we're in church on Sunday. And that would be true hard for the Japanese Christian, but our home was always open for people. She was a wonderful hostess and for all kinds of things, for Bible classes and scenes around our table are things that will be in our memories forever. And it was always so wonderful to be able, even in Tokyo, when we were in language school, there was our first son was born, and we invited 3 girls who worked in a fruit shop up for, I don't know if it was Christmas or not, but they came to our apartment. They had never been in a foreigner's apartment before. And many Japanese had never, their homes were not open like that. And so it was an experience for them to come and to have Bible classes or meals or whatever in our home.
Good, Joyce, too.
I'm going to ask Joyce now to tell about an outstanding, remarkable, visionary outreach that they did with several others, reaching out to mariners, sailors, came from 80 different countries. This is very much a fishing island. And so sailors came for all kinds of reasons, but anyway.
Well, it's not about fishing.
No, not
however.
per se. But anyway, tell us about that
Yeah.
outreach.
We had been in for 20 years and our churches in our town were probably 10 churches, 1 Presbyterian, 2 Catholic, and all very, very small. So one of the Anglican men heard about a work that happens wherever there are ports where ships come in, and it's done by the Anglicans, especially, also Catholics. Seafarers who come into port. He said to us, if we do it together, we could make a club, we called, in our town. So 5 churches, 2 Catholic, us, a Presbyterian, and a Anglican came where they were, and many other volunteers came together to make a seafarers center. And we would go out to the ships. We have to go through the government permission to get out to the ships. And this has become these days very tight because of many international problems. It's very difficult, much easier. We were in what's called it seems to be the largest port north of Tokyo, or north of, Tokyo. Ships in and out every day from many, many countries. And these men, mostly men, are on board. Officers would be maybe 3 or 4 months, but regular seafarers are on board for 10 or 12 months without going home. And the years we started, there was no email or computers to do things. We would go to ships, invite them, introduce ourselves, tell what we did here. Always 2 or 3 volunteers went together and went usually to the captain, introduced our center's activities and asked if they would like a ride to our center. There was no way they could get there because of the shape of the harbor without our bus. And that
Apparently a Greyhound-sized bus.
yes, I was driving one night when a young man behind me said, "Oh, is your driver on vacation?" No, our driver is here. So we would be open for 3 hours in the evening, transport them there, then call home, which they could not do from their ships. And in the early days, we started in the mid-80s. The Filipinos, who are our most number of people were the Filipinos, often they did not have home phone. So we would have to make the call for them and to because they couldn't also speak Japanese. We had to go through a telephone operator in those days and then call to their home and ask for the neighbor where the phone is going to call, tell the wife that there'll be another call in 10 minutes and then make the second call. And then, of course, the seafarer did not understand Japanese, so we had to make all the connections for how much the call was and so on. It's gotten much easier with cell phones. So in the recent years, we were only open in the evening. Sometimes the men have gotten in and can find our property and sit on the steps in the front and do their cell phones from the signal that's going
Oh, yeah.
to the
Oh, yeah.
building. So it's all, many things changed in those
So
years.
was their connection to their family. And in a way, the club became a
Their
kind
home.
of home.
Because some of them,
No.
not so many overall, but some went, for instance, we were in a town with paper making. They need wood chips. Wood chips would come from South Africa, almost 30 days en route. So they would want to make telephone calls home for one thing. So we help them with that.
So I want to touch on a theme which you raised when we were in conversation, that you were there to be servants of Christ by serving not just Christians, but those you met. And that's not normal for sensei, the person with the status, and by definition, a pastor is a sensei. So Bill, would you like to tell us a little bit about what it is to be a servant or demonstrate being a servant?
Well, I think there's many ways. One thing I mentioned to Robin was many of our churches, we met on folding chairs, and so it was the same room used by the kindergarten, but after the service, those were all set aside and everything. But when it came after the service, when they started putting the things away, I just naturally helped. Oh, no, Sensei, you can't do this. This is, I said, no, it's part of my work too.
Yeah.
But just being willing to pitch in and help with a simple thing was helpful to just for relationships. I
Yeah.
think.
Thank you. One of the things that Joyce has alluded to is the close relationship, a fellowship of sorts that was created intentionally among the missionaries, Christian missionaries in their area. And I want you to tell us a little bit about what that meant to you, but also you have to tell us how you ended up preaching twice at a Catholic church.
Yeah, the fellowship was not only to missionaries. We had that was very good, but also within our town, and this does not happen everywhere, but it started when I noticed on the first Friday of every March, there was World's Day of Prayer. Some of you remember that from the past. And World's Day of Prayer was an ecumenical day for churches to get together. And they did that in our town. And then it came around to our church one year. And I just automatically invited the Catholics because they're in our town. I didn't think about the fact that they had never been there before. And there were two Catholic priests, one or two at that time, one maybe. And we had become friends. They were very ecumenical. We intended to be. And so I invited them and then realized some of the others said, oh, well, they've never come before. But anyway, that became a place of, and that's where our volunteer work with seafarers and also with handicapped people went through all of the churches together, and we just were intentional. And so then one time, yeah, the Catholic priest had said on October something or other, it's like Mission Sunday, our Propagation Sunday, which to me sounds a little weird. Anyway, it's Mission Sunday. You're doing mission. Would you come and preach in our church? Well, yeah, okay. So that happened. And I have to say again, because you may not get it, all of this is in Japanese. Our
I know,
lives
I'm
totally are all, yeah. So there's pressure. And so that happened. And then a couple of years later, that priest was gone one day or something. Maybe he was in America, I don't know. And then the elders of the Catholic Church asked me once more to preach. I thought,
Good sign.
that was heavy. And I was grateful for their fellowship and for their acceptance.
Especially since you can't preach in all RCA churches.
Good point.
And by the way, you became ordained at some point.
I did. I started classes in the early 80s, and finally, each time we came home, I took a few more classes. And John Hesslink, bless his soul, said, "Oh, you can't be ordained if you can't do it within 5 years." But John is gone, and it happened. Thanks to Dr. Bergink, who helped me along with church history and so on. So I was ordained in 95. And that really did change
Your
the
role.
relationship and the role in the church. Suddenly, I was more than the assistant missionary, which I never
Robin.
thought of myself as the assistant in any way.
Robin,
Yeah.
So-
going back to being part of the community leads to some very strange things. We had a neighbor we had quite a big garden that our neighbor was using until we moved in and used part of it, but we became friends. But his mother died and we knew her also, but the funeral was in the Buddhist temple just down the hill. So I decided I needed to go to that funeral. I had never been to a Buddhist funeral before, but I knew that you had to take a gift of money that you gave when you entered and then took off your shoes and everything. And I tried to find a place in the back as out of the way as possible. But in the process, Mr. Sato spied me there and came back to thank me for coming and insisted that I go up and sit with the family in the
Wow.
first rows at the temple. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but at some point, people were called upon to go up and offer incense and a prayer in front of the altar. Unfortunately, they didn't call my name. But at some point I did go up and I didn't offer incense, but I made my own prayer. And but that really cemented our relationship
I
with
bet.
that family.
Showing respect.
Yes.
So I want to allude to, but I'm not sure I can make this fit, the sermon today, because he mentioned that everything that we have done good is not lost, including the remarkable faithfulness of the woman you referred to. All those are part of what the nations bring into the kingdom of God. So let's open for questions.
I want to add one more thing, and I'm including George in this conversation. And when we got started in the Seafarers work, about that same time, he got started in helping especially emotionally challenged handicapped people. And this was not church related, but a young man from the community who he happened to be of Korean ancestry, which is in Japan a handicap. But he was very much he was employed by a mental hospital. And he came to George and said, could we work together
Wow.
and get these people out of the hospital? If we have a workplace, these, at that point, they were being hospitalized for life. Lock the door, keep them isolated out in the countryside,
Yeah.
far away, where it's green, it's beautiful. They like it out there.
Which we used to do in Michigan. Oh,
Yeah. But it was a time when there was changes coming, and he asked to work together, and he used George, and they were able to confront the city hall, get money, build a workplace, and
those
so
connections, that's pretty remarkable because
Yeah.
you enjoyed the trust of many
this is
people.
not, again, not church related, but community impact that happened through being faithful to Christ and valuing people of all kinds.
Steve, do you have the picture of the Japanese couple? Yeah. No, it's not a very good picture, but this Mr. Matsuda, who was a retired
Mhm.
school teacher, we called our Japanese grandfather, who was baptized when he was 92.
Wow.
And his wife had been baptized when she was in her 60s and praying constantly for
The
him,
faithfulness.
faithfulness. And he said he had nothing at that age, had nothing else to offer to help to God. And we said, you know, it was not what he was giving to God, it was what God had given to him. And he was baptized.
We love them. Mr. Matsuura was a retired school teacher, and he was so much like my Uncle Herb. It was kind of weird, actually, because in so many ways. But Mrs. Matsuura, one day, a bunch of, well, mostly they were our children's school friends' mothers were at our house. And Mrs. Matsuura came in, and someone asked her, you know, about being a Christian. And she said, you know, it was just like getting a drink of cool water. And, you know, what can you say to that, except it was just such a blessing
Yes.
for her to say that to my neighbors.
I've been a student of learning languages for decades, and I'm wondering for the three of you, which was more challenging, learning and thriving in the spoken language or the written language?
The written, oh my gosh.
Written was more difficult.
In English, it would be the opposite.
In
That's what I was-
Japanese, you can't just look at it and know what it says. In German, you can make a pronunciation. So that's a separate learning skill.
I wonder when you began to communicate with the Japanese people, with the Japanese that you had, how many mistakes did you make? Do you remember one memorable mistake?
Is here all Jay now?
I've tried to forget.
Well, there's a day I came home, I thought, I found hamburger buns. Well, they had sweet bean paste inside.
Yes, yes,
That
yes.
was a reading mistake, spoken mistake.
Mhm.
Probably my most embarrassing one, and now I can't even think how I mixed the words up, but the word for carrot and cute are really alike. And after we moved to Otaru, a young woman came to help teach us language. She had a baby. You can guess where this is going. Fortunately, she had a good sense of humor, so the fact that I referred to her cute baby as a carrot didn't upset her.
I remember Nathan and I had language training much less extensive, and I was supposed to say, what am I doing this year? And I thought I said, I'm going to Tokyo, and I said, I'm going dying. So. And you can't, this dying isn't a verb. You're either dead or alive in Japanese.
With such extended periods, I'm wondering about furloughs, about how often would you get home and how did your children respond to the going back and forth? That's a good question.
In the early days, we went for most of 5 years, the first 2 times, and that was quite extended. After that, we had more choices, and our family tended to go 3 years and 3 months. But at the 3 months or the first time we stayed for a year, and both George and Bill went to graduate work at McCormick Seminary in Chicago. After that, various things, but we always, except for that time, we had to visit the churches that supported us. So it wasn't like vacation,
No.
and but we did see family. So
But we're forever grateful to the Reformed Church because of the mission houses here in Holland.
yes,
You know, we could
That's
just
true.
bring our clothes home.
They're about to sell it.
We didn't have to find a house to live in. That's a blessing.
Elaine spent some time there too. Would you like to add something?
Well, my experience was totally different because I was there for only 3 years. I did not have the 2 years of language study. I started going to language study when I first went there, but when you teach full time, you're very busy, and so I quit. And my association with the Japanese people was primarily with the students at school, Ferris Girls School in Yokohama. And also every Sunday I went down to what is called Shiloh Church. This was in Yokohama. And I taught an English Bible study.
Wow.
So I got to know people there. And that was a very good experience.
We didn't have Joel come to paint pictures for us, but we had his mother as our boss for a couple of years. when she was
Amen.
painting records, and she did a marvelous job.
That was much, much later than my first time in Japan. Yes. Yeah. What were you going to?
When were you there?
What was the incidence of the English language knowledge on the part of the Japanese while you were there? Did that help you to learn their language and their customs, or were they pretty much only language with Japanese?
One of my really good friends who was a Christian, I met
her early on. Helped me, I think. She taught English. You know, it was a Japanese community. We just lived in it. So, we taught Japanese. I taught a class. We had requests for teaching to be taught English always. So I made one class on Tuesday morning, which lasted from 10 o'clock, sometimes through 2 o'clock, because people just stayed and had coffee afterwards and kept talking. But we did stick to English for an hour, and it included all kinds of people. And you couldn't be a real missionary without teaching English.
yeah, I had an English Bible class and then just an English class, which was a holdover from Mrs. McLeod, the previous missionary's wife. And that group, they were quite a bit older than I was. And if there had been a society in Otaru, they would have been a society, I guess, because one of the women was my neighbor and her husband owned a big sake company.
Wow.
I will say, you know, as I said, most Japanese homes had a little Buddhist altar. They had a huge room, and she was very faithful in her observance. But she asked me for a Bible, and she read it very faithfully.
We have 2 minutes, 3 minutes. How about another question, comment? I'm thrilled that you shared these things with us, and it helps deepen and widen our sense of home.
Yeah. You know, we really haven't said very much about the church. And when I think of the pastors and the pastors' wives, it was a struggle, especially when we were first there. The church the kids and I went to was small. The pastor's home was very small. They had 3 children. We used her kitchen because we always had lunch at church on Sunday, because everybody came on Sunday because they came by buses. They came from several miles. One of our members was blind. She had to transfer twice on her bus to get there. And she was very, very, very faithful, even in the wintry weather. And I think especially about the pastors' wives, it couldn't have been easy.
Mhm.
They were responsible for so much. I mean, we all helped clean church. I was amused when they're asking us to come help dust the sanctuary now. Did you see that?
Yes, we saw that.
Every week.
When you folks came home after years over there and you didn't go back, what was the cultural shift like for you?
Missed people, missed friends.
Yeah, yeah. I think I came to Third Church thinking I could get lost in these hundreds of people and not have to. Because when we were there, you were responsible for everything, the programs and the contacts and. Mhm.
Bill, we have a couple of other pictures. Do you want to just say a couple of things about them? For that church, for example,
This one
microphone.
upright is the, every year one church. I was co-pastor of the middle church for several years at the end of our time. And that was a wonderful experience. But then the church, one Sunday afternoon would come for the annual barbecue party in our front yard. And that was,
Barbecue meat.
And how about, is that a picture of the party?
yeah, there we go. That was lamb and bean sprouts and onions and.
That's a really good Japanese term, Genghis Khan. But the things we cooked the barbecue on were like his helmets evidently or something. And it was lamb from New Zealand
Oh, wow.
and it was delicious and it was our summer food.
Go-to summer food.
Oh,
We have-
the summer.
I think one more question.
When we went with Etta and a group to Yukonoshita Church, it was just really interesting. We had two of our kids with us and they took violins and it was an all-day thing. People, because of work and schedules and distance, came and the church was in the morning and then then they had a lunch and then they had all the meetings of the church.
The consistory.
In the afternoon, the consistory, everything. But they were really fascinated with our teenagers that were with us and, asking them so many questions. And it was a marvelous experience.
If you look around in Third Church, there are Japanese things all over the place because we had a sister congregation in Japan that they had groups come here and groups from our church. Third Church went to Japan. So it's a long, long history with our relationship with church in Japan.
Just as
Thanks,
I,
Paul.
just as I was following the pastor out of the sanctuary, I noticed on the wall right there is in script, the kingdom of God in Japanese.
Mhm.
I'd like to know why they brought wood in from South Africa to make paper.
They could get it in quantity and the price is right, I imagine. Yeah, but getting them down is very expensive and they started, I'd say it was in the 90s, they were cutting trees for this and that. And Japan is one of the most forested places in the world, but they were getting a kind of disease from the chainsaw. It's called chainsaw disease, or I think, and it's totally debilitating. You end up with no mobility. And so the insurance payments on account of diseases was higher than what they,
This
There's
is
a
too much
calculation.
fun. So we're going to end now with a thank you and you're welcome to come ask more questions.